Alrighty, so today's video is going to be all about one of the most important turns in the game. We are going to talk about turn one, do a pretty big deep dive into what makes this turn so pivotal in the game, talk about some of the problems that arise because of that, and yeah, just cover a lot of different decks and what their turn ones look like in different matchups. Before we get going, please hit that subscribe button. And if you're interested in some more content from me, do check out my Patreon as well. All right. So, first of all, talk about what is the turn one issue. And then I'm going to talk about different decks and their available turn one tools and what makes that turn so swingy in different matchups, especially the popular matchups in the meta. So, what is the issue? Well, first of all, let's get the big one out of the way. You don't have a lot of control on turn one. It's entirely opening hand dependent, and it's going to be very matchup dependent, right? What's happened so far, right, leading up to Legends of the Force is turn one was pretty flat in a power level. It's changed quite dramatically in Legends of the Force for various reasons, but decks have wildly different potential on their turn ones, and some extreme power plays, but also some weak ones, right? So it's not like every turn one is really, really strong. It's that maybe in one matchup, one of your turn ones is incredibly strong, and all your other ones are kind of lackluster. So what happens in some matchups is you draw it, your win rate skyrockets, right? And in some matchups, you don't have the proper turn one, and your win rate plummets. And the same with your opponent, right? They might have a really good card in that one matchup, but a bunch of turn ones that aren't very powerful. So it leads to some very swingy turn ones. It can be very difficult to navigate, but once you know what's good in each matchup, and this, of course, I will talk about once we get into the actual decks, then really the only thing you can do is mulligan. Like, and try to find it, right? There's like, if you know there's like one turn one that's going to be drastically better, you have to find it. And I've put the math here for you. So in a 50 card deck, in your opening hand, you have about 32% chance to open with a specific turn one, assuming you have 3 copies of it. With a mulligan, it's about 54%, but you can't always mulligan every hand that doesn't have it unless it's like the only card that matters. So you have to like think about that a little bit too. I've also included 60 cards because a lot of decks do play Data Vault, at which point the percentages drop to about 27.5 and then 47.5. So you lose about 5 to 7% chance, which is pretty significant. So there is a punishment for that, especially if there's some really broken turn ones in your Data Vault decks. But let's get right into the like specifics here. So we're going to go through all the Force Throw decks first, and then the rest. And the biggest one here, and maybe the biggest offender in general, is going to be Han 2, but I've lumped him with Yoda and Anakin. I'll talk about them a little separately, but okay, so the big thing here is Han enables some really broken turn ones. More broken basically on the other deck because he gets to play Ogdo, Bogdo, and Grogu. And in specific matchups, those are just incredibly swingy, right? When you play Grogu turn one against like a Vader yellow or even like a Boba Data Vault deck, these pilot decks, your win rate, I'm not going to make up a number. I don't know what the percentage is specifically. All I know is it's a lot. The game is significantly different when you start with Grogu against those decks than when you don't, or even in the mirror. Ogdo Bogdo, same thing. If you're going first and you play Ogdo Bogdo into a lot of these decks, it's just crazy powerful. And unless your opponent specifically has like maybe a shielded unit like Secretive Sage that's right under there, maybe they can't even play a unit. So all of a sudden you've created a huge swing simply because you happened to draw Ogdo Bogdo and your opponent happened to not draw Secretive Sage, right? This is just one example out of many, but similar thing here, right? Maybe you're playing against Boba Data Vault, and your only turn one was Ogdo Bogdo, and their only turn one was a Legion General Pride, and they were going second. I guess they lose the game instantly, right? It's not because they like messed up somewhere. It's just that's what happened, right? Their turn one did not line up correctly against yours. Secret of Sage is another one that potentially presents some problems in as a turn one, because or fixes. You can think about it that way because it's one that's pretty safe as a reactive play. There are some punishes, but less, right? Your opponent starts Sabine unit, and your turn one was going to be Secretive Sage, and this will come up in some other decks that play Secretive Sage. Well, you most likely just lose the game instantly, and it's a little unfortunate how much power and how much swings can occur on this one turn. And Han dramatically exacerbates this just because he also gets to play things like Ogdo Bogdo and Grogu on turn one. Those cards are not particularly good in most other situations. And Yoda, it's like Yoda doesn't have much of this going on. It's more reactive, right? Like if they lead something that's good, but you had Secretive Sage and they can't instant kill it, then you're happy. If your turn one was going to be something like C-3PO and they played Ogdo Bogdo, well, now you're not happy. Anakin is different because his main turn one thing is not always unit dependent. It's just die roll dependent, right? The games where you're first with Anakin in a lot of matchups, specifically the ones that aren't playing Tarkin Town, where you can just jam your unit first, feel significantly better because you now can control with your leader ability something that is much more difficult to do when you are second to play. And then it can be even better when you do lead with something like a shielded unit like Sage, which often can't even get traded back. So there is a lot of this that happens with Anakin, and Anakin's initiative matter ability. This exists on some other cards, like I mentioned, Allegiant Pride, which I'll talk about with the Boba Data Vault section, but that's just die roll dependent. That's just who won the die roll. And so Anakin exacerbates that problem separately from a lot of these other leaders where they're more just dependent on did I like look at my hand and have the right 2-drop for the right matchup. And it's not even always matchup dependent. It's the right 2-drop to counter my opponent's 2-drop, and we're just blind guessing at that point, like who opened with what. So a lot of that is happening. And then throw in Force Throw, you're going to see its image on the next 3 pages because it's all Force decks. That's the other huge issue here, is that so many of these turn 1 plays turn that card on. And now you have to consider that. And that does lead into turn 2, right? It's not that it's happening necessarily on turn 1, although Force Throw can happen on turn 1. But it's more that, like, did I start with a unit that I can use Force Throw with next turn? Did I open Secretive Sage into Force Throw, Adi Gallia into Force Throw, right? It's not, I didn't do anything amazing. Didn't outplay my opponent. I just opened my cards that way. So Force Throw magnifies this whole issue tremendously because of how powerful and cheap it is and how it squeezes into that turn 2 curve or even turn 1 flawlessly with so many decks, and sometimes just instantly wins the game on turn 2. And it is kind of a main issue right now, in my opinion, with the format, is how much weight is being placed on turn 1, and Han is the biggest offender of this, but not the only one. Look at Quinlan here, and Quinlan, it's a bit different because in fact, probably suffers the least out of this turn 1 minigame because it's a ping Tarkin Town deck, which means most decks aren't playing turn 1s into it. So it's going to usually just have initiative and not have to worry about that aspect of like getting blown out there. But there are like really swingy turn 1s here too, right? Well, we'll start with like the Han because we just talked about it. Let's say you open a hand, you're going first, and Sabine is your turn 1 play, which is a very good unit, right? You'll play it. Your opponent has Secretive Sage, I guess you instantly win the game, but your opponent has Grogu. Sabine is actually the worst turn 1 you could have played, because now that Grogu can move 2 damage onto Sabine, and Sabine can't attack the Grogu and survive, which changes a lot of how that turn one's going to function, right? Both L3 and Adigalia, other 2-drops that you would play often with Quinlan, do survive that transaction because they can both take 2 and then can then take another 1 damage from the Grogu when they attack it. So they are better, right? And your only control over this is the mulligan. If Sabine is your only turn 1 in your opening hand, you heavily need to consider mulliganing. And this deck also only plays 1 space turn 1. And in tons of matchups, you can't play space on turn 1. Like all these ground battles, you actually don't want to start in space. But against something like Vader, your win rate skyrockets if this is in your opening hand. And it's not the Vader's fault that you played A-Wing. It's not your fault that you have it in your deck. But should a matchup change by orders of magnitude, like I don't know the number, but should it change so dramatically just based on you drawing an A-Wing in your turn 1? Maybe. Sabine is a pretty big offender in general because of how it does function against all the shielded units, and shielded units are pretty powerful on turn 1 because they're the ones that can kind of get through this Tarkin Town pinging world a little bit, and they tend to be pretty sturdy. So it's like this whole mini game that's happening on turn 1. But in fact, Quinlan's probably the most minor offender of this, specifically with its units. There's a different offender here, and that's the Tarkin Town card, which I'll talk about later, that also dramatically messes with the power level on turn 1. But Quinlan also has the Force Throw. Did you open Adi Force Throw and you could just go Adi turn 2, like Force Throw your opponent and often just win the game on the spot? Yeah, that's still alive in Quinlan. It's less likely than a lot of the other decks because it doesn't play as many early Force units. Here's another Force Throw deck, and these are major. Like, Migs is one of the biggest offenders of this whole thing because Migs versus basically any other start Kylo has is just a world of difference, right? You play Migs, means you can just basically kill any turn 1 play your opponent has, unless it's L3 or like Secretive Sage, right? And that, again, just amplifies this mini game that happens in some matchups, right? Your Quinlan sits against Kylo. I mulliganed for L3, I didn't find it. My opponent opened Migs. My win rate drops dramatically. And it's not because I did anything wrong. It just so happens that they had Migs, I didn't have L3. Same with like the decks that play Secretive Sage. It's just a huge shift. And like when Kylo doesn't have Migs, it's a very different game. There's even like this mini combo here with Witch of the Mist Force Throw turn 1. And it's not a very likely thing to happen in a game. It's in the like teens of percentages to open a hand with those 2 cards. But when you do, you sometimes win the game instantly. And that's, in my opinion, a problem. It's a problem that turn 1 can crush decks sometimes. There shouldn't be so much power on this turn because there's no real way to express your deck or your skill when all you can do is look at your 6 opening cards and be like, I hope they don't have this. So Kylo, in fact, the Kylo red deck is a pretty big offender of the power spike, right? When it's Migs and like when they have to open Karis, it's like a pretty different game because that unit doesn't really do anything other than turn on Force Throw and Force Lightning, of course. So there's always that Force Throw angle here thrown into all of this because of how so many units turn that on. And then the last one's Talzin, and this is pretty similar to Quinlan, but Talzin suffers from this dynamic a little more because she's not playing Tarkin Town. She isn't always able to like dictate who has initiative, right? It's Secret Sage is the unit I had, but my opponent started Sabine. That's a problem for me. Acolyte of the Beyond is probably like the safest one in a lot of matchups. It's like the worst unit, but at least if they're value killing it with something like Sabine, you can then get the Force and kill that Sabine back. The games where you can open Karis feel a lot better because it's just the best unit you have on turn 1. And most of the things will turn on Force Throw, so there's always that in it. But these matchups can also sometimes shift depending on which of these cards you can open with and which matchup are you playing against, right? Against Cad Bane, for instance, it has to be Secretive Sage or you really can't play a unit on turn 1. And unless they play one first, and sometimes they will. So it's pretty challenging to like just guess and like hope that your opening hand is right. And Talzin, I do think suffers a little less than most. It's in that similar vein to Quinlan, but definitely gets hit by this harder than Quinlan. All right, so that's it for the force throw stuff. Let's talk about some other offenders and some other decks. So the Cad Bane with Bazine, for instance. Sometimes you have a hand, again, let's say you're playing against Cad Bane and you only opened with 1/2 drop, but you have like a good curve. Are you supposed to mulligan? It's really hard to say, but when they start Bazine, they go first and play Bazine against you and they take your turn 1, that can really shift the game pretty dramatically if you miss your turn 1. It doesn't mean you auto lose, it's just a pretty big shift. Criminal Muscle is actually an interesting one to include here because the new wave of Cad Bane, there's a lot of Cad Banes now playing much more of like an aggro 1-drop version of Cad. So their whole plan with Tarkin Town is to play a guy, then kind of force you to play a guy into them, and then they'll play their second 1-drop and ping Tarkin Town. And that's part of their strategy. That's not like a variance thing. That is a strategy, but I include Criminal Muscle here because the best way to actually counter this, or at least the best mini counter to this, is to play a shielded unit. So again, we mentioned L3 and Secretive Sage a lot, but they're very pivotal cards right now. But if you do that, and then they happen to have Criminal Muscle as their other turn 1 play, they can actually still defeat that shield and then ping your unit and still Tarkin Town it. Did you do something wrong by playing L3 or Secretive Sage? No, but you got completely blown out anyway because they happened to open with 1 copy of this Criminal Muscle card, which they're playing 3 of. Should your as you're playing Cad Bane, should you be hard mulliganing for a Criminal Muscle opener in case your opponent has a shielded unit? Like, it's really weird to have to think about that because it's so spiky. It's like when you do it, it's a pretty big spike, and when you don't, you might fall behind because now that unit's gonna just free kill one of yours, and you kind of like lose that mini advantage that you're trying to gain by doing the double 1-drop Tarkin Town. So there's definitely some spike potential in these Cad Bane openers. Boba. Allegiant Pride is a major offender of this, and it's like written on the card. I really don't like if I have initiative on a 2-drop, like this card is hardly playable if you're not going first, and just incredibly pushed when you are, and winning a die roll is not something that I think should dictate how powerful a card is, right? As if you've played against Boba, you know how much different games can feel when they're first and play Pride and immediately hit you for 5 damage on the first turn versus when they open with any other card. And I include Kylo's TIE Silencer actually as like a issue sometimes, right? If you have to lead with Kylo's TIE Silencer and then your opponent plays like Grogu in Han, do you just like you lose a lot of those games simply because of that opener, right? And it's not like you are like in that much control, right? Maybe you had to mulligan and Kylo's tie was your only turn 1, or should you be mulliganing your first hand if Kylo's TIE Silencer is your only turn 1? It's like weird to have to think about it, but your win percentages shift so dramatically if you open Kylo into a Grogu. So maybe that is required. So Boba has like offenders on one side, but also has like a huge swing in power level in its turn 1 plays, right? Because like TIE Bomber, Kylo's TIE, like they're all pretty drastically different in power level depending on what matchup they're a part of. Villain control, there's basically only one thing to say here: Pershing. And like Iden opening Pershing, it's just a different game than when they don't. And Pershing has been a pretty big offender of this for a long time. And of course, some of these decks also play Super Laser Tech. So when you have like that 2 to 3 curve, it's pretty powerful, right? So Kylo Data Vault often plays Pershing. When you see Kira's, right? It's just often very different. And, you know, if you're playing like maybe a Kylo or a Kira and you're playing something like Inferno 4 in your deck, when you find that, your win rate against Vader is going to be a lot higher than if you don't find it. And it's just opening hand dependent, very swingy. And a lot of these existed in the past. It's not like all of these cards are new. It's just more of this is happening now than it used to. And it used to be maybe not as pronounced. And like the opening Inferno 4 against the Vader is good, but it's not like breaking the win rate in one direction. Not nearly as much as some of the newer things break win rates. And lastly, Sabine and Vader, and they actually like don't really have these major swings. Like Vader's issue is more what your opponent has and not so much what it has. All its turn one plays are actually just kind of bad units. The whole point is that you're playing 2 units in space on turn 1. So if your opponent does open with a space unit, and a lot of decks can't afford to put too many turn 1 space units in their deck, then it's way worse for you. And when they don't, it's way better for you. Sabine, you know, they're playing like half ground, half space right now. Some of them are just different in power level. Like Sabine does play a 3-2 in space, similar to the Kylo's TIE Silencer. Your opponent opens Grogu, you're sad. In fact, your opponent opens Grogu, you're probably sad no matter which of your units you play. But it's these decks don't fall too much into these like major spikes on turn 1. Not nearly as much as a lot of other decks, but they do suffer from the turn 1 spikes, like the turn 1 force unit into force throw. Both punish both these decks very hard. Mention like if your opponent has the right space unit to counter your opener, things like that, right? And let's say you're Sabine and your only turn 1 is Sabine, and you're going second, and like your opponent plays a Battlefield Marine or their own Sabine or something, and like, yeah, it can be very swingy, but none of this is new. And not like, it's not that all of this needs to be fixed or corrected. Like, yeah, there's going to be some times where you simply don't have the right 2-drop in a particular matchup, or like the exact one you had was the exact one that was like kind of countered or soft countered by your opponent. It's just kind of happening in every matchup right now, and some decks are major offenders of this. So these are, in my opinion, the biggest offenders right now. And it is, I think Han, the leader, is the biggest offender of this because, yeah, like, so there's cards that are just completely out of control on turn 1 with this leader that lead to, like, kind of annoying play patterns. Force Throw is probably the second biggest offender of this. And although it's not a turn 1 play, it's, like, turned on by the turn 1 play. So I think it's worth including here. It leads to the most swingy games imaginable, games that sometimes end immediately on turn 2 because of this card. Then we got Migs. I think Migs is an incredibly huge offender because the games Kylo Tarkentown opens with this versus doesn't open with this are wildly different. Like, probably the biggest difference in a deck that I can see right now is actually this, unless we say Han. The thing is, Han has so many broken turn 1s that it's always doing something kind of busted there. Kylo has this one, or the like Witch of the Mist plus Force Throw, but that's such a small percentage. But yeah, wildly different. Allegiant Pride is kind of like secondary to Migs, right? It's because, first of all, it's only going to work when you have initiative, similar to like the Anakin thing, where that's a lot of focus on that. And then, yeah, it's just much more powerful than every other turn 1 Boba has when you do have initiative. And then Tarkentown. I said I'd mention this. Yeah, it kind of warps turn 1. It's not, but it's ever present. So there is counterplay to this, but it like forces every deck to have the counterplay or know the play pattern of how to like get past this, right? About when you're supposed to pass into the Tarkentown deck, what units are acceptable to play, which ones won't get punished the hardest. It's interesting because it's not like really a turn 1 play. In fact, it's not often used on turn 1 anymore because the decks that try to maneuver through it don't let that happen, but it like warps turn 1 pretty heavily. All right, so in wrap up, what are kind of the fixes or things that I would want to see? So I would like to see less swingy turn 1 power. That's the things we talked about, like Migs, right? Han starting Grogu, General Pride on the when you're going first. I want to see more generic power on turn 1, but less swingy power. I actually don't think it's bad to raise the power level of turn 1, but I think if you're going to do that, you actually need to do it more. You need every card, like you want less swings in that turn one. Like, should every unit be Gunji? Like, what if you could just play 12 Gunjis? Right? It's kind of a joke, but then they're all equal and there's not that many swings, right? As opposed to right now, if you're playing like a green yellow force deck, it's like Gunji or the Padawan. That's like the second best one, right? Huge difference in power level between those two cards. And you don't have a lot of control. So I think we actually want less differences between the power level, right? Karis versus Acolyte of the Beyond. It's just a wildly different experience in a lot of matchups. And, I don't like that. I think the swings and like the differences, those should happen higher up in the curve. Turn one should have actually a flatter power curve. And we used to kind of have that. There wasn't that many swings in power level on turn one, but now there really are. So you end up with high variance games because of this. Because no, you're not going to open Karis every time you play Talzin. You're not going to open Gunji every time you play like a green force deck. Like you're not going to open Migs every time you play Kylo Tarkentown. So maybe the win rates will be pretty flat. Like a matchup will be 50-50, but it's not because every game was 50-50. It's just that like one game you had Migs and you were like 80-20, and one game you didn't and you were 20-80. And again, I'm like making up those numbers as I go. It's more just to kind of explain my view on this. So that's one thing I'd like. I want to decrease blowouts in the early game, and the biggest offender of that is Force Throw. I'm still going to say it. It's time for that card to go. It's just creating too many non-games. It's in more than half of the winning decks right now. Top 8 decks, close to half, I think, in PQs and higher. It's completely warping early games. Sure, the format is sort of balanced right now. There's tons of decks that are playable. Games themselves are not balanced, though. They're often dictated by this card entirely. So less blowouts. Force Throw is the biggest offender, but there are others, right? As I mentioned throughout. I kind of said already, decrease the power differences between turn one plays. I think there should be a flatter power level. Doesn't mean they all need to be the same, but they can't be so wildly different in power level that all you can do is like mulligan and cross your fingers and hope that you find your broken turn one play. And lastly, we got to get rid of initiative matters. Die roll stuff, cards that reward die rolls I'm not into that. In fact, Pride is that, but Anakin is also that, like the leader. Like it's a very interesting leader, but I don't love how dramatically its power shifts when it goes first versus going second. I think it's just too much emphasis on initiative, and it hasn't been a huge thing in this game, which I'm happy about. I've actually been pleasantly surprised how initiative hasn't mattered much. Until this set, I think initiative has started to matter a lot more in Legends of the Force than it ever has. And it's not even really about new cards, right? Pride is not a new card. Anakin is not a new leader. But there's something in the games that's happening that's making initiative way more important and creating even more blowouts in the early game. So these are just some things that I'd hope we can move forward from. As I mentioned, with the biggest offenders, I do think like the Han interaction with some of these units has gone too far. I think Force Throw, obviously, I've mentioned it a lot, and I know I'll get pushback on it from some, and that's fine. Like if you enjoy Force Throwing, that's cool. It used to be like the thing I like to doing the most, but I just don't like how games are becoming more and more swingy, more and more like what are the top 6 to 8 cards of my deck versus what are the top 6-8 cards of my opponent's deck, and just like, okay, we know who wins. Like it's happening a lot in games right now. So these are some things that I would be interested to see kind of worked on. That's what I got for you. I hope you enjoyed this sort of like different style strategy video, right? It's not about any one deck. It's about one turn and how important that turn has become, more important than it's ever been at any other stage in Star Wars Unlimited. And I hope that we get to move past a meta where turn one carries so much weight into who wins and loses the game. But yeah, let me know what you think, and until next time, take care.